Good evening and welcome to tonight's program. The Lincoln Presidential Foundation is proud to officially launch Warning Signs, Lincoln's Response to Rising Threats to Freedom, Justice, and Democracy. This project, made possible with the generous support from Iron Mountain, is both history and a call to action for all citizens to be engaged in the responsibilities we each have in self-government. The project includes an array of new resources, including a companion docuseries, and we'll be premiering part 1, Broken Compromises, of the docuseries in just a moment, followed by a discussion led by our president and CEO, Erin Carlson Mast, and featuring Dr. Lucas Morel and educator Adina Barnett Miller. My name is Phyllis Evans, and I'm the Senior Director of Development for the Foundation. Before we begin our program this evening, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us and remind you that following tonight's presentation, we will entertain questions from the audience. Please type your questions throughout the program in a Q&A box below, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. And now, the filming premiere of Part 1, Warning Signs, Lincoln's Response to Rising Tensions in the 1850s.
The 1850s was a time of great political crisis for the country. You've got violence everywhere as the nation is just fracturing over this issue of slavery. You have people shooting each other and chopping their heads open with broadswords. In the US Senate, you have Charles Sumner getting beaten to within an inch of his life.
It's a period in which people are incredibly engaged with the political world.
During the 1850s, there were clear warning signs, if you will, about political trouble brewing. Trouble brewing sufficiently enough that it could eventually disrupt the Union, produce what was called at the time secession, that could very likely lead to civil war.
Lincoln was a lawyer. He was a very effective lawyer. He was a lawyer that did a lot of traveling in Illinois. He did what's called riding circuit, which meant he went from courtroom to courtroom throughout the state of Illinois.
He is very well known in the state. He was known to be a conscientious, hardworking, deeply honest lawyer.
He was one of those guys that you just wanted around. He was funny, he told incredible stories, he always had a way about, making light of a situation. And so in addition to being just a beautiful speaker and someone who had a way with words in the most serious moments, he knew how to cut a serious moment with a joke. He knew how to make people feel more comfortable.
As a lawyer dealing with these personal conflicts between individuals, he tries to often be a peacemaker, to get people to resolve their differences outside of court if they can, to settle without having to go through the expense and the burden of a trial. And so I think that idea of Lincoln as a peacemaker really influences the way he approaches politics later in life.
He was very active in the Whig Party in the 1840s. He would travel around on circuit as a lawyer, trying cases, and then in the evening often would give political speeches.
His political hero was Henry Clay, which is controversial. Henry Clay was a slave owner. What Lincoln most admired about Henry Clay, of course, was his tendency toward compromise, his willingness to hear all sides of an argument. But that said, Abraham Lincoln always disliked slavery.
He serves one term in Congress between 1847 and 1849. He steps out of politics and does not return to politics with both feet until 1854, which is surprising for us because, of course, in 1850, a huge political event occurred.
In 1850, Congress passed a huge compromise measure known as the Compromise of 1850. And I think most Americans believed that would resolve a lot of the political differences that were arising between the North and the South. Southerners had been threatening secession, going all the way back to the founding of the nation. But those calls for Southern secession really amplify beginning around 1849 and 1850 as the nation is coming out of the Mexican War and trying to figure out, what are we going to do with all of this land we've just acquired from Mexico? White Southerners believe that if they are not allowed to take slaves into this land that has been purchased, they would say, by the common blood and treasure of the whole nation, then they believe the only result that can come is secession and civil war.
The Compromise of 1850 was the final settlement that came out of the US-Mexico War. It is a very complicated piece of legislation because it is actually several bills in one. There were 6 provisions in the ultimate compromise. 3 tended to favor southern states and 3 tended to favor northern states. The ones that are really important are that California came in as a free state to the Union. Northerners also were able to fit in the end of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. They were not able to get rid of slavery in DC proper, but they were able to eliminate the slave trade. Texas had been in a boundary dispute with New Mexico, and that was solved in favor of New Mexico. Then there were some southern provisions, and the most famous of them and the most important for this period was the Fugitive Slave Act, which was part of the Compromise of 1850. And the Fugitive Slave Act was the biggest expansion of federal power in the period before the Civil War. This is a misconception about this period, that people in the South were only in favor of state rights. In this period, they were actually very much in favor of using the federal government to protect slavery as much as possible. And the Fugitive Slave Act is the best example of this.
Under this new Fugitive Slave Act, you have a number of provisions that really stack the deck against African Americans who are accused of being fugitives.
If you were apprehended and somebody claimed you were a fugitive from slavery, you did not get to speak in your own behalf at that hearing. You had no benefit of legal counsel.
One of the key things about the Fugitive Slave Act was that it compelled Northerners to participate in this process. So in the past, it was possible to sort of ignore what was going on if you wanted to. Now, after the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, you are required to participate.
The judge got paid $5 if he said, that's not the guy, the evidence the slaveholder produced is ridiculous. Doesn't hold up in this court. That judge got paid $5. If he said, ha ha, good enough for government work, yeah, that's the guy, he got paid double.
Following the passage of this law, 332 African Americans are sent into bondage, only 11 are set free. And it's estimated that upwards of 20,000 Black people flee the North and go to Canada rather than risk the chance of being arrested and sent into the South.
This is the single most affecting law that comes out of this period. It's also the law that inspires Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, which probably is one of the 3 or 4 most important sparks for the Civil War. It really helps to get people in the North to see the plight of Black people in the South and to worry about it. And it became this sort of manifesto against slavery in the North. As a result, you end up with much more anger and concern about it, and Lincoln certainly is unhappy with what's going on there.
We are so appreciative of Iron Mountain for their foresight and support of this project as part of their Journey to Equal Rights initiative. It's a common saying that in order to avoid repeating history, we have to know history. But that's easier said than done, though it's worth the ongoing effort. The work of history, gathering evidence to develop an understanding of what was and what is, asking thoughtful questions, is at the heart of civic education today. Now, there's a lot to unpack about this period in US history, but we are joined tonight by 2 people who can help us do just that. Dr. Lucas Morel, the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and head of the Department of Politics at Washington and Lee University. He holds a PhD in political science from Claremont Graduate University too. He's the author of Lincoln and the American Founding and Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government. He's the editor of Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages, and Ralph Ellison and the Raft of Hope, A Political Companion to Invisible Man. And he's co-editor of The New Territory, Ralph Ellison and the 21st Century. Dr. Morel conducts high school teacher workshops for the Ashbrook Center, Jack Miller Center, Gilder Lehrman Institute, Bill of Rights Institute, and the Liberty Fund. And he's a former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, a founding member of the Academic Freedom Alliance, a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society, consultant on the Library of Congress exhibits on Lincoln and the Civil War, and currently serves on the U.S. Semiquincentennial Commission, which will plan activities to commemorate the founding of the United States of America in 4 short years. We are also honored to be joined this evening by Adina Barnett Miller, a veteran educator at Ripley High School. She was named the 2021 West Virginia History Teacher of the Year. A 2003 graduate of West Virginia Wesleyan, Barnett returned to Ripley High School, her alma mater, to teach. In 2011, she won the James Madison Foundation Fellowship, which funded her master's degree in American History and Government from Ashland University in Ohio. Barnett also won the West Virginia DAR Outstanding Teacher of American History in 2016 and placed 3rd in the nationwide contest. In 2019, she was the first West Virginian to win the James Madison Congressional Fellowship, and she serves as president-elect of the West Virginia Council for the Social Studies. Not only did Adina develop the excellent high school lesson plan that is part of our warning signs project, she had Lucas as a graduate advisor. We didn't realize that until after the fact, but of course, once we knew, we could not resist inviting her to be part of tonight's program. Lucas and Adina, welcome to you both. Lucas, I'd like to start with you.
Sure.
This project is focused on the years between Congressman Abraham Lincoln ending his term as a U.S. representative in March 1849 and his inauguration to the U.S. presidency in March of 1861. A lot happened in the intervening decade, including renewed threats of secession, political violence, and deep polarization. So please set the stage for us, if you will. What had Lincoln's political experience been up to that point? What were the issues he was most concerned with when serving in the U.S. Congress?
Well, thank you, Erin, and welcome everyone to this broadcast. I appreciate the fact that people are still interested in Abraham Lincoln. I found through my many years of teaching an annual seminar on Lincoln that nobody's met on Lincoln. They're either high on him or not so high on him. And so I'm glad that you all showed up tonight. Lincoln's concerns coming out of his one term in Congress, which coincided with the conclusion of the Mexican War, was precisely about the expansion of slavery in the nation. And the fact that he only served one term, part of that was due to an agreement ahead of time that among the Whigs, which the party he was a part of at the time, they had agreed to rotate amongst themselves in terms of who should stand for office, as they said back then. You didn't run for office, you stood for office. But the other reason why he stepped away from politics was because it seemed like those compromise measures of 1850 seemed to settle things sufficiently enough that Lincoln could, as it were, return to his day job, which was practicing attorney. And it was only when Stephen Douglas, whom Lincoln knew since their state legislative days, it was only when Stephen Douglas was able to pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed for the possibility of slavery entering north of the Mason-Dixon line, beyond Missouri, of course, into the territories now known as Kansas and Nebraska. And Lincoln thought, wait a second, I thought we settled that back in 1820 when there was at least a sufficient national consensus that slavery was going to be contained. The federal Constitution didn't permit Congress, according to most people's interpretation, to abolish slavery wherever it existed in the United States. But in federal territory, ever since the 1787 ordinance that dealt with Northwest Territory, Congress was understood to have this authority over territories, including whether they were going to allow slavery or not. 1820 presumably settled that. Only Missouri got to come in north of the Mason-Dixon line with slavery. In 1854, Stephen Douglas of Illinois says, hey, let the settlers decide this, not congressmen. And it passed. And Lincoln said, whoa, this is a break in the national faith, the national consensus. and the possibility of slavery expanding. Here's the crazy thing. And he called it insidious. What's insidious about it is that you don't have to actually have a national movement to expand slavery. All you have to do is persuade most Americans that it's not their business. Take it off the congressional table, let local settlers decide the matter. And lo and behold, Lincoln says, you get a few selfish people who can make money, white people making money off the backs of black people. And lo and behold, that's going to lead to the spread of slavery. So that's the thing in 54 that gets Lincoln back into politics, as I say, with both feet. And of course, he's in as an engaged citizen for the balance of that decade until he runs for political office for the presidency.
Well, so Lucas, let's talk about that a little bit, because you mentioned that here, he doesn't jump back in with both feet after the Compromise of 1850, even though the Fugitive Slave Act, which is part of that, as we just heard in this film, really, it essentially is that great political cartoon, which is, I think the title of it is something about, slavery being shoved down the throat of the free soilers or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the title of that political cartoon was, but it's very graphic and evocative about what they thought was happening here. Right. And that, that does sort of speak more to the Kansas-Nebraska Act side of it, but that was the Fugitive Slave Act too. So if Lincoln's positioned himself as someone who, adheres to the U.S. Constitution, itself a compromise. Yes. And then there are these subsequent compromises, it's an issue that keeps getting compromised on. Why, what is it specifically about Kansas-Nebraska and the argument Stephen Douglas is making in particular that really set Lincoln off here? How is this not just another example of, letting the people of this country make this decision? How is this not, democracy in action?
Yeah, that's a good question. The biggest difference that I see is that in 1850, at least, the Fugitive Slave Act is an obligation under the United States Constitution. In other words, there is a fugitive slave clause. We wouldn't have the United States Constitution but for an agreement. Unfortunately, it was a concession to a very small number of states at the time, principally Georgia and South Carolina. It was a concession to them. Basically, they thought, look, in the same way that a fugitive from justice, whether it's a thief or a murderer, if he escapes into a slave, you expect him to be extradited back to your state. That's the governor's responsibility. And each state is going to do that for each other. In this case, it was, whoa, a fugitive from justice, but the fugitive is, according to your state law, a human being that you are treating like a brute, a member of the brute creation. Most of the free states were uncomfortable with that, but we wouldn't have the Constitution but for that. So Lincoln said, look, it is, as they said, so nominated in the bond. This was part of the deal and we're going to live up to it. And in 1850, as bad as the Fugitive Slave Act was, iniquitous on its face for a number of reasons that were spelled out in the video, Lincoln said, a deal is a deal. We have to abide by the Constitution. Fast forward 4 years later, and Stephen Douglas is now saying, oh, remember that territory that we had agreed we'll let Missouri in with their slaves, but all this remaining portion of the Louisiana Territory north of the Mason-Dixon line, slavery is forbidden. Now you're putting that back on the table. It's like you eating your half of the sandwich and my holding on to mine. And if later on I decide I'm about to eat it and you say, no, let's compromise over your piece of the sandwich. Lincoln thought that was just manifestly a breach of faith. And more importantly, he knew that, again, under the Constitution, the first step towards ultimately abolishing slavery everywhere was to keep it from spreading. And that, he thought, Stephen Douglas was doing the free states and the future of America no favors by putting slavery back on the table and saying, well, let local settlers decide whether they want it or not. Lincoln said, this is a decision for every American to make. Congress has the authority and they should exercise it accordingly.
Thank you so much for that. And you mentioned Stephen Douglas, and of course, one of the often referenced political events of the 1850s are the Lincoln-Douglas debates. What were the competing visions for what this country would be that Lincoln and Douglas were offering voters, and remind us who those voters were? too.
Yeah, well, number one, if history is anything, it's context. If you don't have the context, you're in trouble. You can pretty much claim anything. In the context in 1858, which is not the first time they meet, but Stephen Douglas is the incumbent senator. He is the head of the Committee on Territories. That's how he got the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed 4 years earlier. In 1858, the context is Illinois voters. Remember, Illinois at the time had hundreds of thousands of white people, maybe 6,000 or 7,000 Black people. They are this much of the population, and yet there is, alas, a pervasive bigotry towards Black people. They have their own version of Black codes, if you will. They can't serve on juries. They can't serve in the militia. Juries, if there's a white defendant, can't serve in the militia. They're not allowed to vote. And the abolitionists are a very small and fringe, if you will, element of the population. So you've got a, at least moderate to extremely bigoted white population that Lincoln and Douglas are courting. And so Lincoln has to tread very carefully in terms of eliciting and reaching out for voters who are, may not like Black people, but don't like slavery. It's a free state, after all. Lincoln's got to court them, but recognize that they don't want to look like they're in favor of any expansion of rights for Black people. Stephen Douglas, on the other hand, he is a categorical white supremacist. He uses this phrase, white basis. He says our revolutionary fathers formed this country for themselves, and those selves were white people. I mean, he was kind of like the prototypical George Wallace, not segregation today, segregation tomorrow. We're talking white supremacy today, tomorrow, and forever. Stephen Douglas didn't care for Black people or other what he called inferior races. He definitely thought that any rights and privileges that they had were totally at the discretion of the white population of Illinois. So that was the battle in 1858. Douglas is not pro-slavery, outwardly, but the policy of popular sovereignty, and you should always append the adjective local in front of that. His policy of popular sovereignty, which says, let states and let territories decide for themselves what their domestic institutions should be. And that was a euphemism almost always for slavery. We've decided in Illinois not to make slaves of Black people. Pat yourself on the back. But we also aren't crazy enough to give them the vote, right? That was basically his position. And he says, why shouldn't settlers in the federal territories have the same power to do that? And his claim was, this isn't new, that this was the policy of the Temple of Liberty, that he called it the cornerstone of the Temple of Liberty of our revolutionary fathers. He said, at the time of the founding, they believed in, and this was his word, diversity. That was his word for federalism. In other words, nobody at the Constitutional Convention said Congress should decide, let's make every state free, let's make every state slave. And so Douglas says, that diversity on the question of slavery, we should follow the same thing. I am the proper interpreter of the founders, not Lincoln, who wants to squash all the states into one image, what he called the doctrine of uniformity. Lincoln wants to, in fact, encourage a sectional war. In other words, have the free states bully the southern slaveholding states into becoming free, which of course was an exaggeration and a caricature of Lincoln's position. But essentially, those were the two sides. Lincoln saying, we don't believe that the federal government has authority over slavery in the states, but we do believe that they have long had that authority in the territories and they should exercise it. Stephen Douglas, local popular sovereignty, says, no, let local settlers, meaning local white settlers, decide, slavery is good for us, we'll have it. If not, we'll rule it out. That's the American way.
Interesting. Adina, the context for this time is very different than our own. And you have, as we discussed when we were talking amongst ourselves before this program started, your students, you go up to seniors in high school and people going into college, and then they go right over from you basically to folks in Dr. Morel's position. And so there's a continuum here from an educational perspective. How do your students, and I think at this point, all of your students are from this millennium, and Lucas, you might have some who might be from last millennium, but especially maybe graduate students, but by and large, these are people whose context is very different. how do they grapple? How do your students grapple, Adina, with the tension between the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the subsequent compromises, the Constitution itself, and the compromises we're talking about in this conversation today? How do they deal with the fact that those subsequent compromises seem to betray those very ideals that our country was based on?
Well, as Lucas said before, context is key. And I think that that's something that you build in. I teach a survey class. So our class starts back basically at Jamestown, and we work our way to Reconstruction. And so I think that, talking about our nation's history, you don't just throw something out at one time. You build and build and build. And so a lot of this conversation has to start back at the Constitutional Convention, or even before that, looking at, why the revolution happened and all the things building up to the revolution. And so one of the key things that I always think about and I always talk about with my students is this idea of a more perfect union. And I even talked about this today. We're not perfect. None of us are perfect. There's never been a perfect government. There never will be a perfect government. But our goal as Americans is to strive for that perfection and to do better than the generation before us. And so we build on that and that story throughout the whole of history, and about, when these difficult questions come up about, what our Constitution means and what it means in subsequent generations, it's what their level of what they see as that perfect union they're striving for.
That's wonderful. And in your lesson plan that you created for high school students for this project, Adina, you focused on Lincoln's speech at Cooper Union at the tail end of this time period we're talking about here in 1860. What prompted you to choose that speech in particular? What do you find so pivotal and important about that speech that you wanted to focus on that for students?
Well, I chose Cooper Union specifically because I like that how Lincoln, it's very different than most Lincoln speeches. He looks at the Cooper Union address kind of as his debut into this arena of being a candidate for the presidency in 1860, excuse me. My students do that all the time, by the way. He sets the historical groundwork at looking at the Constitution and at the framers of the Constitution and how they interpreted the slavery question. And so that's why I chose this, because I think that instead of it being something that's so political, it is political later on, because he really, like, a large portion of the speech is targeted at a Southern audience who's going to be reading it. But he lays this strong historical groundwork. And that's why I chose it, because I think that it harkens back to those lessons that we've already had in American history class, if you're doing a survey class, and it'll connect those pieces of the Constitutional Convention and the early Republic for students. So it's more of a refresher instead of introducing something that's totally new and foreign to them.
That's great. So it's building on all that knowledge that they already have, and they're able to see it in a context maybe even more similar to Lincoln himself intended it, right? Because they have that background knowledge. That's great.
That was the whole thought.
Well, and it's wonderful, and it comes together really well. We're excited for teachers to be able to use that. And for any of the teachers in our audience, that lesson plan is available on the lincolnpresidential.org website. So you can download that this evening if you want to, and start using that lesson plan and those materials in your classroom. Lucas, you're a political scientist. We often treat you like a historian, but I know that you're a political scientist. So in your work, I was wondering, what's the biggest misconception you encounter about the politics of this era that we're talking about, the 1850s?
I think like watching either the Titanic or a documentary on Nixon, the end already, and you're kind of just waiting for the corner to finally get around that corner. With studying this period, the 1850s, we already assume, oh yeah, that's the decade where Lincoln becomes president. No one in their right mind, I would say, including Lincoln, thought in 1850 he would actually have a remote chance of becoming president of the United States. And again, in 1850, he's got maybe a toenail involved in politics, but he's really, riding circuit, as the video series showed, full time. The person they really need to know and no better is Stephen Douglas. Everyone associates the 1850 Compromise with Henry Clay, and rightly so. He is the great compromiser, right? Nullification, the tariff, the Missouri Compromise. He was the man you went to. In 1850, he failed to get the compromise measures passed as one bill, as we say today, an omnibus bill. It was Stephen Douglas who was able to cobble together the majorities for each piece of that. And so starting in 1850, and then through the rest of that decade, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, his fight with the Democratic administration, his own leader, James Buchanan in 1857 over Lecompton, which capital, which constitution is going to represent, legitimately represent the settlers of Kansas. And then, of course, he defeats Lincoln when he runs for re-election, reappointment as senator in 1858. The 50s are about Douglas. But for Lincoln, I would say, and I have a course that I could teach you to back this up, but for Lincoln, the United States would have taken a very different path into the future in 1860. And it's Lincoln and the Republican Party that really makes slavery a front burner issue for the country. And Lincoln had to do it in a way, again, politics is about, or not about, as Adina pointed out, there is no perfection in politics. As the great Professor Harvey Mansfield once said, we didn't have a perfect founding. We shouldn't expect to have had one. Politics is the art of the possible. And it's about getting, I mean, the mark of statesmanship is about getting as much justice as you can get a majority to support. And so the task of Lincoln was to chart a different course for the country, a country, I think it's safe to say, that wasn't overwhelmingly in favor of improving the lives of people who didn't look like them, namely Black people, and yet a country where there was a significant majority that didn't think slavery was consistent with what the founders expected for their new republic. And so I think we can't put a bigger lens on Stephen Douglas. We really need to see that the country, especially come 1860, had choices that were presented to them. That choice, in a certain sense, was presented 4 years earlier when the Republicans ran their first nominee for president, John Fremont, and he failed to run the table among the free states, right? He missed a few key ones, Illinois, I think, being one of them. And I think Lincoln learned from that. He campaigned vigorously for Fremont in 1856. That's when Lincoln first declared out loud that he was a Republican. For 2 years, he thinks, I think I'm the only Whig in the United States between 54 and 56. Lincoln comes out big for Fremont in 56. And in that loss, I think he recognized, that first bite of the apple, we did pretty well. 4 years from now, we're going to have to make a case in a slightly different way. We can't allow the opposition to tag us as abolitionists. And that's a distinction my students have to kind of warm to. They kind of assume, well, Lincoln, didn't he pass the Emancipation Proclamation? Didn't he issue that? Wasn't he the lobbyist or, strong lobbyist behind the scenes for the 13th Amendment? He's not an abolitionist. And we'll have to show them the distinction between being an abolitionist on the one hand and anti-slavery on the other. Lincoln had to shape a party and speak for a party in 1860 that was anti-slavery, but wouldn't look like the extremism of, say, the Garrisonians, William Lloyd Garrison, on the fringe of the abolitionists at that time. But Douglas, if you're going to teach Lincoln, you got to make it a fair fight. It's not just Lincoln versus, Southern fire-eating, slaveholders. It's Lincoln versus Stephen Douglas. The action in the late 50s isn't in the South. It's for the minds of white Northerners, and whether you're going to get them to see that their own rights as human beings and as citizens have everything to do with people who don't look like them and the potential for them being enslaved elsewhere.
How does Lincoln accomplish that? I mean, to your point, how does he achieve not being branded, someone of John Brown's ilk, right? Yes.
Well, number one is what has already been mentioned, an imperfect document, but a document that is equipped. It's Frederick Douglass, not Stephen Douglas, but Frederick Douglass said that this contained the levers of freedom. The US Constitution, as compromised as it was, contained that openness for improvement and change to form a more perfect union. It contained the principles, if understood in light of the Declaration of Independence. So Lincoln was trying to get the country back on the rails in terms of preventing the expansion of slavery by saying, let's not forget the Declaration. Let's not forget the purposes, our mission statement, if you will, as one people. That's found in the Declaration. Let's not forget that and use that as the lens through which we understand our obligations and our duties under the Constitution. Alas, that means for the foreseeable future, Congress does not have the authority, let alone a president, certainly not in peacetime, to abolish slavery where it already exists. But can't we do things to prevent it from expanding? We've done it historically by preventing the introduction of additional slaves by banning the importation as soon as we could under the Constitution, January 1, 1808. That law was signed by slaveholder Thomas Jefferson in March of the previous year to take effect as soon as constitutionally permissible. 12 years later, in 1820, importing slaves into the United States is equated with piracy. The only punishment is, as they said, hanging by the neck until dead. So prevent the supply. And then also the other side is prevent its expansion, starting with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which was renewed under the first Congress under the Constitution, and subsequently the 1820 Compromise. Lincoln pointed these things out in his speeches to tell the country, not only do we have principles on our side that are anti-slavery principles, we have history on our side. So one thing that I've learned after teaching this for about 30 years is that Lincoln, he wasn't the only one talking about our past. He wasn't the only one talking about the Declaration and our revolutionary fathers. It really was contending against the most important politician of the 1850s, Stephen Douglas. It was a contest over who understood the founders correctly and who could therefore best keep the Union together for the sake of liberty.
So that sounds like a familiar debate. You know, what did the founders mean and how does that affect what we're doing today? But what is the biggest difference, in your view, between American politics and political engagement then and how that differs from today?
Well, I'll start with what's similar, and what's similar is just as you say, or as Elena Kagan once said, we're all originalists now. Everybody wants to have the founders on their side now. And so just as there was a debate in Lincoln's time as to who had the correct interpretation, and the presumption was whoever had that, that's what we should follow. Today, there is a very robust, I don't need to tell you or this audience that there is a very robust debate over what the founders intended, what was going on in the Declaration, to what extent was slavery critical or essential to the founding of this country? Did they really intend to get rid of it, or were they extending its lease on life, if you will? So that I find is the same. In terms of differences, I think one major difference is just in terms of how we talk about politics today. We don't hear a whole lot, and certainly rhetorically aren't equipped to talk a lot about what used to be known as the common good. Politics is always going to be us versus them, but as George Washington was at pains to remind us over and over again, and especially in his farewell address, is we have to remember the oneness, the unum, that is, from which, unum out of the pluribus, as it were. We have to remember, what is it that we share as Americans? Yes, there's a tremendous diversity. There are so many ways in which our identities are all over the map. But what we don't do well today is we don't speak the language of the fathers. We don't speak the language of the founders. We're no longer talking about the laws of nature and of nature's God. We say a lot about rights, but untethered from what the founders at least understood was a natural rights political philosophy, that there was this unchanging ground of the things that are changing and diverse. Without that sort of language, we just kind of, as we say today, we're so polarized, we just kind of hunker down into our silos and our camps, that the only thing that matters is, are you in the majority? Right? On the Supreme Court, are you in the majority? I don't need to tell you how important that was. When just look at the last, the last few appointments that were made. Those hearings were so can I say that they were crazy? That people took them so seriously because the thing that mattered was, will we be in the numerical majority? There was very little discussion about how the majority is going to act consistent with the rights of the minority. That is to say, consistent with that which both majority members of the majority and minority possess, which is their rights as American citizens, and even more fundamentally, their rights as human beings. Those sorts of conversations, I don't hear a whole heck of a lot from either party today. And I think, oh boy, midterms are coming, let alone 2 years from now, the presidential contest again. Who is going to be able to step up and speak, not just in purple prose, but in a real grounded in principled sense, speak in the language, the rhetoric of the American founding, which is a rhetoric not just of rights, but a rhetoric of what we all possess as human beings and as citizens. So I think we need to that we need to reclaim and recover.
Thank you, Lucas. And I think there are several speeches from Lincoln where he eloquently alludes to that, coming back to the fountain, coming back to those original ideals. Adina, you have students who have never voted in an election before because they're not of age. They're coming into their power as citizens in this country. Do they draw connections between what broke down in the past in this country and their responsibilities as a citizen? Have there been any sort of aha moments or moments of anxiety, maybe even for your students when they realize, oh my goodness, this can fall apart pretty quickly and easily? When you look at all the times there were secession crises, and how are they feeling about it as people coming into their rights as citizens?
Well, so I'm really lucky. I teach the U.S. history classes that I teach are 10th graders. So those kids are 15, going to be 16. So I feel like a lot of what I do is, we got the roots there, and we're teaching American history. So this class that I teach to seniors is state and local politics. And so that's a class where I register them. And so we're able in that class to really look at politics on a micro scale and about what's happening locally, especially with people that they know. And so that is really, to me, the way that I grab them and get them engaged and get them wanting to be part of the political process, because we're able to look at local information, what's happening locally, and show, heck, we had an election where someone won by 16 votes. Wow. So, and that gets them to want to vote because they see that their votes matter on that micro scale. But a lot of why they want to vote is because of those lessons they learn about how to be a good citizen in American history class. And again, we're not a perfect country, and that's okay. And we like I told my students today, I said, it's not a perfect country, but do I love it? Absolutely, with all of my heart. And so I think that what I'm doing in American history class is we have to, as voters, as citizens, we have to know our nation's history so we can move forward and make good decisions about the people that we're going to elect, and also about being engaged in our government. I know that, like my generation, we didn't have civics class, and so I think that my generation of adults they're not engaged voters. They're not engaged civically. They don't know how to get engaged civically. They don't know how to even get involved in local government. And so I think that what we're really doing for kids now is we're building them a strong basis in understanding how our government works, and also how our history works. And it all has to go together. It has to work together. And I think that by, registering them while they're still in school, and, we have a day where we go to the polls together, early vote together, that we're taking something that seems really scary and foreign to them and making it understandable and important, and it makes them want to engage in it, not just now, but in the future.
I so appreciate that, especially because talking about the local elections where they might see more immediacy and know the people and might feel like they have more of a direct connection than sort of what it feels like we sometimes fall into, which is this trap of the every 4-year presidential election,
Right.
which is not, there are so many other ways to be civically engaged every other day of the year. So I have to ask, have either of you had a former student who ran for office?
Yes. Yeah. Actually, one of my students literally finished my civics class, was a freshman in college, and ran for school board as a freshman in college. He just turned 21 today, and he's planning on running for the House of Delegates in the next election cycle. But he came in, they picked 3, he came in 4th. And I mean, he had a great showing. And what was great about that was that class, 100% of them were registered to vote, his graduating class. And so we won an award here in West Virginia, where they award to high schools, they get 100% of their students registered to vote. And so like I told him, I said, you have how many hundreds of people that you helped register to vote that are going to be voting for you. So he did a great job, and he plans on hopefully running in 2 years.
That's fantastic. One last question before we turn to audience questions. Lucas, in a later episode in this series that we'll see in a subsequent program, you recount that on the way to the presidency, so he's been elected, he's on his way, Lincoln's invited to a reception in the capital of New Jersey, and he gives a brief speech. Since we have you here with us for this program, will you please tell us about that speech, what Lincoln was saying to them and why, and the lessons for us as we strive to perpetuate this republic up to and beyond the nation's 250th anniversary?
Yes, this is a significant speech that's a little commented on. It's in late February. He's on his way to the Capitol. We have to remember that Lincoln was elected in the first week of November, but he doesn't take office. At the time, you didn't assume office until March 4th. So that's several months along the way. And so what's happening in the country, of course, is it's in the hands of James Buchanan, who said, I don't think secession is constitutional or legal, but I also don't think neither I nor Congress can do anything about it. That was his gift to President-elect Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln had a lot of time to think about what he was going to say on March 4th. And people implored him to give speeches before he became president officially, because December 20th and 24th, South Carolina secedes. And then by the time March 4th rolls along, in January and February, 6 other states join South Carolina, and they form a provisional Confederate government. Jefferson Davis is president and Alexander Stephens is vice president. Lincoln resists giving speeches precisely because he says, look, if people really want to know what I think, it's all in the record. I even published an account of the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debate. So if they were serious about wanting to know what I think, it's in English. I don't know what to tell you. He thought if he said anything, it would just be misconstrued by his enemies. Well, the closer he gets to the Capitol, the more forthcoming, shall we say, he is. He stops briefly in Trenton, New Jersey, and he speaks before the state Senate, and he knows that most of them did not vote for him. And he says as much, but he says, I am more glad that you are holding this reception for me than if it were being held by my friends, because even though you didn't vote for me, I'm paraphrasing, you understand that according to the Constitution, I am the next president of the United States. I am the constitutional representative of the American people. And he thought that example towards a Republican by Democrats was an example that wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you down in the South could benefit from. They were doing precisely what the Republicans did 4 years earlier. When they lost, they didn't say to James Buchanan, the Democrat from Pennsylvania, not my president. They weren't preaching resistance. They said, the American way is, if at first you don't succeed, try again. I said succeed, not succeed. Nice pivot though. There were Americans, once they heard that Lincoln and the Republicans were successful in the fall of 1860, they said, not my president. They said, resistance, we're no longer a part of this country. We think it's heads we win, tails you lose. And Lincoln thought, in a republic, to be viable, to perpetuate itself over time, it has to produce good winners and good losers. These Democrats were showing how in America to be good losers. The sore losers, the bad losers were the ones who were responsible for the division in the country that ultimately led to a civil war. Lincoln said, we need to profit from this example of these Democrats. We've always done it this way. It is the only way we can remain one people. It's the only way to practice self-government. Is you participate in an election, you are saying at the outset, I will abide by the result regardless of who it is. Had Breckinridge won, who was the sitting vice president, had Breckinridge won and the Southern Democrats, the slaveholders, won that election, how many states do you think they thought Breckinridge should be president over? Not just those south of the Mason-Dixon line and throw in Missouri for good measure, the whole country. And so those New Jersey Democrats, to their credit, I'm pretty sure that reception wasn't very long for Lincoln. They didn't like Lincoln, but they were acting like good Americans because they were abiding by the Constitution.
Wonderful. So we have about 10 to 12 questions here already. Question 1 comes from Melvin, who asks, why is Abraham Lincoln a the central figure of the United States of America? Lucas, do you want to take this?
I'll make my answer short. 2 reasons: because he fought to save America and fought successfully. So he was a very effective commander-in-chief. But the reason why I believe he's the most iconic president, the one we remember most, is because he spoke in a way to be remembered. He says in his most ironic statement ever, in the middle of his few appropriate remarks at Gettysburg, men will little note nor long remember what we say here. Bull Oni. Lincoln knew very well and spent a very concerted time in crafting those 272 words to be delivered when he was not the keynote speaker on November 19th, 1863. Lincoln made himself memorable, and he did so with an eloquence that drew from the Bible, that drew from Shakespeare. He was a man of words because he was a man of letters, almost completely self-taught. He read voraciously, not widely, but the things he liked, he chewed and digested, and he annoyed his law partners because he read out loud. The thing you're taught, in 2nd grade not to do, Lincoln did it all the time, and it annoyed anybody in the office. But it was because of Lincoln's gift of words. I don't think there's a president that comes close to having that eloquence as an orator and as a writer. Again, not just showing off and being mellifluous and purple prose, but the penetrating insight and lucidity with which he spoke about America, the United States, its principles, its structures, and as we just spoke about earlier, the civic habits that we have to engage in terms of the rule of law and abiding by the Constitution. He spoke about those things that no one before or ever since did with such felicity.
Thank you. Question 2 comes from Stephen, and he wants to know if either of you can speak to the role Congressman William Richardson, Douglas's ally and lieutenant, played in enacting the Compromise of 1850.
Bummer. Adina's keeping her thing on mute, so
it's on you.
She beat me to it. I would say the very fact that you know that he was a helpmate to Stephen Douglas already demonstrates you know more about that gentleman than I do. I don't know much more than that. I know that there is a man named Reg Anstrom who's publishing a series of kind of semi-biographies of Stephen Douglas right now. So if I can get a contact information, I can send along that person's name, and you can look him up. Prior to this new effort, I think the best biography is a pretty old one by Robert Johansen, and so we are way overdue for a more up to date and scholarly edition of a biography of Stephen Arnold Douglas. So alas, I can't tell you. I can't tell you how Douglas did it in 1850, but I can tell you that it went a long way to establishing him as not just the most important Democrat, the most important politician up until 1860 in America.
So question 3, James Reed asks, and this is for you, Lucas, during their 1858 debates, Stephen Douglas argued that because Lincoln said people of all races were included in the Declaration of Independence, then Lincoln couldn't stop halfway, that if Black people were included in that document, then they would be entitled to citizenship and voting rights also. Douglas was certainly a total white supremacist, but on this one point, could he have been right that Lincoln couldn't say yes to the Declaration of Independence, but no to voting rights?
Yeah, this is a question. I mean, it was anticipated somewhat by, or at least my answer was anticipated somewhat by what I said earlier, that politics is not it's the art of the possible. And so whereas a guy like William Lloyd Garrison or even Frederick Douglass, whom I adore, could be pure in their principles and in their understanding of what self-government obligates us all to. Lincoln himself said, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This is my definition of democracy." He also understood that being pure and, if you will, perfect in terms of one's political principles doesn't guarantee you a majority. And in this country, as I like to tell my students, equality is on one side of the Declaration coin and consent is on the other. So even though Lincoln was as rock-ribbed devoted to equal rights, the equal rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as a Garrison, as a Stephen Douglas, not as a Stephen Douglas, as a Frederick Douglass, he also recognized by that same token that the way you get to equality can only come by consent. And that means you have to garner the public's support. And so Lincoln couldn't ask for the whole enchilada in 1858. He had to consider his audience. And his point was, look, I'm here and people who are categorical racists are over there. I have to step to them. I can't just simply say, come over to my island where everything is pure and noble and good, and you'll figure out how to be righteous if you do so. Lincoln had to come to them and build a bridge. I keep mentioning rhetoric, just persuasion. He had to persuade them to at least take a few steps towards him. And in doing so, he hoped, I would argue, he hoped that he would build a consensus that would eventually recognize, as he did as president, that they deserve the vote, something he was not in favor of in 1858. He ends his presidency arguing out loud, the first president in American history to call for the vote for Black people. My great friend and someone who's forgotten more about Lincoln than I can remember, Michael Burlingame, has made this point for decades, that Lincoln should be considered among the great civil rights leaders of our country because he died in great measure because John Wilkes Booth heard that speech when Lincoln argued for vote. And I'll be polite here, but Booth was said to have remarked that, that means Negro citizenship. I'm going to run him through. So the idea of kidnapping the president then became a murder assassination plot. So Lincoln always understood what the implications were for the principles that he was so devoted to in the Declaration. But to press truth to power, to actually carry that out, he couldn't do it unilaterally. He had to bring Americans, and in this case, Illinoisans, along with him. Let's put it this way. If he couldn't, if it was still an open debate as to whether or not whites in Illinois were in favor of Blacks being granted their natural rights. Okay, Stephen Douglas wasn't even willing to do that. He said, no, that's up for white people to determine. If Lincoln, if that was still a matter of debate for whites, he couldn't even put voting on the table. And after all, in 1858, as Lincoln reminded Stephen Douglas, voting rights were not a federal issue. Those were almost entirely a state matter. And so what Lincoln said to Douglas at least one time during the debates is, you seem to be so concerned about Black people not getting the right to vote. Why don't you stay here in Illinois and make sure that you accomplish that objective, and the rest of y'all can send me to Congress, to the Senate, where I can deal with national issues.
Okay, I'm going to beg Phyllis to let us take one more of these questions.
I got to be more brief.
Oh, it's this is largely on me because it's, but these are great long questions. I so appreciate them. Greg asks, and this is sort of focusing on the Whig aspect of Lincoln. I'm going to try to paraphrase this, but he says that, essentially, why did Lincoln see no future in working to sustain the Whigs with him as a national leader, and instead shifted to the emerging Republican Party. He says this seems to write off the prospect of working with Southerners and focusing on the North, possibly leading to Southern animosity,
Okay, I'm going to do the short version here. Is he didn't write off Southerners. Southerners wrote off him, i.e., actually, they didn't even know about Lincoln. They wrote off the Whig Party. Slavery was part of the reason the Whig Party imploded. In other words, Southern Whigs by 1850, this is even before 1852, and by 1850 figured out Whigs are not, they don't have our back, because they're not in favor of protecting the rights of whites taking blacks into federal territory and making slaves of them. And so Lincoln found a party falling apart around him. And so for 2 years, between 1854 and 1856, Lincoln not only doesn't know if there are any more Whigs out there, he's uncertain about the direction of the Republican Party. So his own friends who are Republicans, Lincoln's going, I don't know, there's a lot of anti-immigrants here, anti-Catholics. Yeah, they're good on the slave question, but I don't know about these other things. And it wasn't until 56 that Lincoln figured out, and a lot of this had to do with his own politicking and persuasion, it wasn't until the Republican Party fused, coalesced, they really were a coalition party. It wasn't until they coalesced around one fundamental plank, and that is no slavery in the territories. That to put a stop to that, when that became the thing that was the litmus test, he said, okay, this is a big enough stick that we can hit the Democrats with. Nothing else seemed to rise to that level for Lincoln in the mid 1850s.
Thank you. And Adina, Susan just wanted to know if you were familiar with the Youth in Government program through YMCA, because she thought, given what you're doing, it's a wonderful program that instills knowledge of government in high school students.
Yes, we have a
Excellent.
club at our school.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. Dr. Lucas Morel, Adina Barnett-Miller, pleasure as always. We're so glad to have you with us here tonight. Phyllis, back to you.
All right. Yes, thank you both so much for lending your expertise to the Warning Signs Project and for your ongoing education efforts and for tonight's discussion. Sincerely appreciated. We are also grateful for our partnership with Iron Mountain and to finally be able to share this project with our members and donors through online webinars this fall. Next up, we have a great program featuring Dr. Rachel Sheldon on Tuesday, October 18th at 7 p.m. This program will feature additional clips from the docuseries and will focus our discussion on Lincoln's response to Supreme Court decisions, his view of the court, and the court's impact on issues in the decade prior to succession. Please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org and register for the next session and the two that follow that. As you close out tonight's webinar, you'll see a short survey. Please take a moment to complete the survey, as it helps us to improve our offerings to you and lets us know what you would like to see in the future. As always, thank you to each of you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all in October. Good night.